Hey everyone, welcome to This Explainer. Today we're unpacking a truly fascinating puzzle, the complex economic transformation of a newly independent nation. We're going to trace India's industrial evolution over a really crucial four-decade stretch, starting in 1948 all the way up to a massive breaking point in 1991. It's a story of incredible ambition, absolutely huge hurdles, and some seriously dramatic policy shifts.
Okay, let's dive into this. What exactly drives a nation's industrial revolution? Think about it. How does a country literally build its economic engines from scratch when the starting line is practically at zero? It doesn't just happen by accident. It requires a grand design, a strict set of rules that dictates exactly how, where, and by whom things will be built.
Well, that grand design is what we call an industrial policy. It's basically the collection of procedures, principles, and regulations from the government that directly impact industrial establishments. Simply put, this policy acts as the ultimate blueprint for a country's economic survival and growth. It shapes the entire pattern of industrialization, deciding whether private entrepreneurs take the wheel or if the state itself acts as the primary builder. To see exactly how India tackled this, here's our roadmap for this explainer. First, India's industrial baseline. Then, setting policy goals. Next, the economic constitution. After that, evolution through the 70s. And finally, the 1991 turning point. Let's get to it.
All right, part 1. India's industrial baseline, the starting line at independence.
At independence, the stakes couldn't have been higher. India's industrial sector was extremely underdeveloped. We're talking a critical lack of basic infrastructure industries, total technological deprivation. There was a massive lack of indigenous capital and investments, and whatever modern industry actually did exist was highly concentrated in just a few metropolitan areas. Add to that a severe lack of an entrepreneurial class ready to take massive risks. Faced with this absolute lack of resources, heavy state intervention didn't just seem like an option to leaders at the time, it felt absolutely crucial for survival.
Moving on to part 2, setting the policy goals, a blueprint for growth.
Faced with those monumental deficits, the government had to act fast. So the crucial point is that these new goals became the North Star for the nation. The objectives were laid out clearly: maintain sustained growth in productivity, enhance gainful employment for a massive population, and achieve optimal utilization of human resources. Ultimately, they wanted to attain international competitiveness and transform India into a major global partner. And honestly, these well-intentioned goals ended up shaping practically every single policy decision for the next 4 decades.
And to hit those targets, the government went to work. We are looking at over 40 years of constant government tinkering here. Starting with the first resolution in 1948, moving through the foundational 1956 policy, shifting focus in the 70s and 80s towards smaller scale and tech, and finally arriving at the massive 1991 shift. Let's rewind a bit and see where it all kicked off.
That very first step in 1948 was all about defining exactly what the state would do versus what private capital would do. By setting up 4 distinct sectors, ranging from state monopolies down to private enterprises, the government aimed to remove uncertainties that were holding back private capital. They even went as far as establishing a 3-year industrial truce between management and labor just to get things moving smoothly.
Which brings us to part 3, the economic constitution. The state takes the lead in 1956. Now, 1948 was kinda just the warm-up. They needed an aggressive solution for that severe lack of capital. Enter the Industrial Policy Resolution of 1956. This one is huge. It's quite literally known as India's economic constitution, and it was heavily shaped by the Maulana Bose model of growth. The main takeaway from this model is that pushing heavy industries would lead to long-term, higher growth. But because private business just wasn't strong enough yet to do that, this policy gave absolute primacy to the state. The government took direct responsibility for building heavy industry, dividing things into 3 strict schedules where the state controlled the biggest monopolies.
Going into part 4 now, evolution through the 70s, tinkering, decentralization, and fragmentation.
As we hit the 70s, the foundational rules were set, but the government really started heavily micromanaging. And this brilliantly illustrates how the categorizations just grew more and more complex. In 48, we had 4 sectors. In 56, 3 schedules. By 1973, they spun up a new core industries classification. And by 1977, the focus shifted to decentralization, heavily recognizing small industries, even breaking them down into incredibly specific subcategories like cottage, tiny, and small scale, just to restrict the power of large business houses. The administrative complexity literally expanded side by side with the calendar. To enforce all of these complex divisions, a seriously rigid legislative framework was built. You might know this heavily controlled era historically as the license Raj. The whole point of this licensing system was to give physical effect to the government's policies. Step 1 was the Industries Development and Regulation Act of 1951. Step 2 was the MRTP Act, the Monopolies Restrictive Trade Practices Act in 1969, designed to restrict domestic monopolies. And Step 3, in 1973, was the FARA Act, or Foreign Exchange Regulation Act, which tightly regulated foreign investment. The state literally had its hands firmly on every single lever of the economy.
All right, our final section, Part 5, the 1991 turning point, the breaking point and resolution. So 40 years of intense state control and a deeply complicated legislative framework finally brought the entire system to its absolute breaking point. While the intended outcomes were noble, inward orientation, shielding industries from harsh foreign competition, focusing on rural development, the actual realities were pretty bleak. Severe administrative hurdles and red tapeism totally strangled growth. There was underutilization of capacities and really poor performance from public sector enterprises. Plus, with indiscriminate protection from competition, there was basically zero incentive to actually upgrade technology.
Let's move to and see how this builds into the big climax of our explainer. Because those inefficiencies were simply too great to ignore, a massive pivot was completely unavoidable. In 1991, everything changed. The statement on industrial policy that year marked a major fundamental reversal. It effectively dismantled those rigid structures of the past and suddenly shifted the primary emphasis right back to the private sector, opening the economy to the very competition and foreign investment it had spent decades keeping out.
As we wrap up, I want to leave you with this fascinating historical paradox to chew on. Could the rapid, dynamic, private sector-led growth that India experienced after 1991 have even been possible without those heavy state-forced industrial foundations built back in 1956? It's so tempting to look back at past policies of heavy control simply as mistakes, but maybe it's more accurate to view them as stepping stones, flawed, sure, but entirely necessary phases of a nation learning to stand on its own 2 feet. Think about that as you continue to explore economic history. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep asking great questions.